It's on now, I can tell. Good evening. I'm Kim Walsh-Childers. I'm a professor here in the College of Journalism and Communications, and it is my privilege to welcome you to the latest in our series of Science Journalist in Residence talks. This program was developed as part of the university's Preeminence Initiative and gives students and faculty the opportunity to deepen their knowledge of science writing and journalism while interacting with some of its most captivating practitioners. These journalists spend a few days on our campus, leading class discussions and participating in one-on-one talks with students, faculty, and researchers from various colleges. We owe great thanks to Provost Joseph Glover, the UF Office of Research Communications, and faculty and staff members from across the university who helped bring this together. And of course, we want to thank the Bob Graham Center for co-hosting this event. And it turns out that we have one more person to thank, particularly tonight, and that's Denise Chow's mom. Denise tells me that as an undergraduate, she was headed for a career as an attorney. And it was her mom, a very pragmatic accountant, no less, who counseled her that she might not like being stuck in an office doing the same thing day after day. She knew that Denise liked talking to people, having a variety of experiences, and writing. So she wisely suggested that Denise ought to give journalism a try. Fortunately for us and for science reporting audiences all over, Denise took up her mom's advice. Her career has taken her to space.com, where, and I'm so jealous as I say this, she covered the final 3 space shuttle missions and both the launch and the Mars landing of NASA's Curiosity rover. She's been a writer and editor for livescience.com, eventually serving as managing editor, where she oversaw science and tech coverage. And under her supervision, Live Sciences relaunched Tech Vertical, which focuses on artificial intelligence, robotics, and military technologies, increased its traffic from 17 million to 21 million monthly visits. That seems like a fairly substantial increase to me. Now, as the science and tech editor for NBC News' Vertical MACH, Denise writes and edits stories dealing with science and technology innovation, coordinates science coverage with other NBC shows and departments, and also manages content syndication to several partners, including space.com, where she first began as a science writer. Please welcome our 2018 spring science journalist in residence, Denise Chow. Oh, and please turn off your cell phones. I brought mine to remind me.
Thank you so much for having me. I decided to take the long way so I don't trip on the way up here. It turns out that moms are right a lot of the time. I know that from experience. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's been a real privilege, and I've really, really enjoyed my time at UF this week. I've learned a lot, and there's been a lot of opportunities for me to chat with new journalists, journalism classes, also researchers, and there's a lot of really phenomenal work being done here, and I feel very lucky to have been offered an opportunity to see some of this in action. So, as you probably saw by now, the title of this talk is How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Writing About Animal Poop. When Professor Walsh-Childers asked me to send her the title for my talk, I remember sitting at my laptop and pressing send and then wondering how many minutes would go by before my invitation to UF was rescinded. But I'm very glad that didn't happen, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. Now, despite the title of the talk and what it may suggest, this doesn't actually have anything to do with Stanley Kubrick. And what I have to say isn't meant to be satirical, unless something goes horribly wrong. But I chose this title because I actually am a worrier. I get it from my mom, really. I worry about things that are so far out of my control, and I sometimes amaze myself even with my ability to overthink things. But there are some things that I've learned along the way that keep that other monster at bay, and there are some lessons that I'd love to share with you. One way to frame it is that these lessons are things that I've learned so far in my career, but I actually feel a little bit weird saying that because any kind of retrospective at this point feels a little premature. I'm still very much a work in progress, and I hope that there's so much more for me to learn and do in my career. So let's just, whatever, call it what you want, but I put together a couple things that have either guided me or changed my perspective about this field that I work in. And actually, when I was putting together this list, it sort of made me realize that these are kind of lessons that apply more broadly in life, and that was not my intention. But so my hope is that if you take some of these away from you, if it's not something that you work on in journalism, if you have no plan to go into it, that hopefully it'll be interesting, if not applicable. So here we go. Number 1, be realistic. When I first decided I wanted to study journalism, I dreamt of working in a newspaper in New York. I had such a romantic view of, newsrooms where people were just clacking away on typewriters and probably had a bottle of bourbon in the bottom drawer of their desk. And that's my idea of what I wished for my career. I went to New York University for graduate school. And in one of my first journalism classes, it was for an elective called narrative nonfiction. So it's akin to things that long form pieces that you would read in like the New Yorker. My professor had us go around the room and talk about our background, what brought us here, and why we wanted to go into journalism. And so we did that, and then afterwards he stood up and he said, guys, this is a really tough industry. And with layoffs happening more and more, newspapers and magazines downsizing, it's only going to get more tough. And if you have any other skills, literally any other skills, go and do that. I remember turning to the person beside me and saying, I hope this is not his idea of a pep talk. And it took me years to understand really what he was getting at. I didn't understand why he would come into a class full of brand new master's candidates and say that, but I realized that he wasn't really trying to scare us, although the outcome was that most of us were terrified already. He was making sure that we had our expectations in check. He was a newspaperman. He was a brilliant, brilliant investigative reporter. And he was scared about whether his job would still be his job a year from now. And I learned from him that life is often messier than we picture it in our heads, and to succeed in any way, we really have to be comfortable embracing that messiness. So as it turns out, every job that I've had since I graduated has been in the digital space. The changes that my professor at that time was seeing that filled him with a lot of trepidation, they were becoming the building blocks, the foundation for my career. And I'm happy to say that his career has also continued to thrive. Legacy media hasn't gone away. It's changed a lot, but it hasn't disappeared. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But in case you're wondering, I did work for a newspaper for a short time. I interned at the New York Daily News, which is a tabloid newspaper in New York City. And as my professor had predicted, the industry was changing, so I wasn't writing for the paper. I worked on the web team. And covering local news was one of the most challenging but rewarding things that I did as an early career journalist. And yes, I did find that some old school journalists do indeed keep a bottle of bourbon in their desks, but that's neither here nor there. Lesson number 2, try to do things that scare you a little bit. So I've spent almost a decade now as a science journalist, but I got into it completely by accident. And some of my current colleagues, a lot of my former colleagues, got into this line of work because they had always been proud science geeks. And some of them had gone the academic route. They'd either gotten their masters or PhDs in some area of science before realizing that they were really more interested in communicating science rather than being in a lab. I don't have a science background at all. In fact, the last time I elected to take a science course was in high school. And I've never been shy about the fact that this makes me feel a little bit like a fraud. But the self-doubt that I could have in this position, I learned to do away with a long time ago. My first job after grad school was as a reporter for Space.com. I was actually hired to be a general science and tech reporter, but 2 weeks after I started, there was an opening at Space.com, and they asked if I was interested, and I said yes without really thinking about it. And I almost immediately regretted it after I said that, because I thought that maybe I had made the worst mistake of my life. I don't think I'll ever forget my first real assignment for Space.com. I was writing about acid rain on Jupiter. And when the story came back from my editor, it looked like a slaughterhouse. There were red marks everywhere. I think there were maybe a couple of pronouns that were kept untouched, but that was pretty much it. And I learned pretty quickly that I was going to have to work probably twice as hard as my peers who had some background knowledge and some foundation in science to pull from. But I made a pact with myself. I knew it was going to be an uphill battle. But I said, what better way to train myself to be a good reporter, to be a really thorough reporter? Because I didn't have a background in astronomy or astrophysics, I couldn't make any assumptions when I was writing my stories. I had to ask the dumb questions. I had to go back to the basics. And I probably made a fool of myself more times than I can count. But I decided that the most important thing was getting what I needed for the story. I just had to do what I needed to get the information. It took me probably 6 months and maybe even a full year before I really felt comfortable at space.com. But if I'm being honest, I don't know that I ever feel 100% comfortable with any of the topics I write about. Just this week, I've been working on a story about the science of a wrinkle in time, and it's about whether it's possible to time travel through wormholes. And after 6 interviews with theoretical physicists and something like 14 pages of notes, I am terrified to write this story. But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe if you aren't a little afraid, you aren't being challenged enough. So, lesson number 3. Trust yourself, but check your ego at the door. I used to cover a lot of rocket launches. The first time I went to Cape Canaveral, I was really excited to be there. It was someplace that, as a kid, I'd wanted to be an astronaut. I was just thrilled. And I figured that being astronaut adjacent somehow made me cooler somehow. But so here I was an enthusiastic young reporter, and I walked into NASA's briefing room, and the entire room was filled with older white males. And I was 22 at the time. I'm a female, and I'm a visible minority. So to say that I stuck out a bit is putting it mildly. And I remember very distinctly that a celebrated space reporter, who I later became very good friends with, he came up to me and he said, "Are you lost, kid?" And, that's very hard to recover from. But it has improved significantly. Space reporting, even though it has improved significantly, though, space reporting is very much an old boys club. And a lot of these reporters that I was working with and that I would spend 2 weeks at a time with, they would remind me constantly that they'd been doing this since before I was born. They were like on a first name basis with the NASA administrator, and they would sit around and they would swap stories about covering the Gemini program or remember that time during the Apollo missions, and I'd never felt more like a kid at a grown-up's table. But the easy and self-defeating way to respond to this would say that I am at a significant disadvantage, and that was certainly true. But the other way, and the way I chose to look at it, was that I write for a lay audience. So it doesn't matter how many degrees I have, and it doesn't matter how many years I've been covering NASA. I still have to write my stories in a way that is accessible to anyone who stumbles on them. My number one priority and my responsibility is to my readers. And it's on me to provide the accuracy, the clarity, the depth, to educate them, entertain them, or inspire them. And that, I'm happy to say, has been my North Star ever since. And at the time, I don't think I was really conscious of this. It was more just a survival mechanism. I don't think I had the emotional maturity or the self-awareness to fully understand how this change in my own perception would shape me or my work. But when I look back on what I feel are really pivotal moments in my career, I can really draw very clear lines between that realization and this current mix of fearlessness and naivete that makes me just deluded enough to walk up to the Elon Musks of the world or the Chuck Yeagers of the world and the Al Gores of the world and pester them with questions. Lesson number 4, do not be afraid of the unknown. Embrace the uncertainty. I should mention this is the last lesson, so don't worry, it's almost over. I go to a lot of recruiting events at universities now. And like many industries, growth in journalism seems to be very cyclical. Some years, it seems like companies are expanding very rapidly and there's such a hunger for new talent. And other years, it seems like there are so many more grads than there are exhibitors with real job opportunities available. Well, I'm not an oracle, but I can tell you something about where I think this industry is going. It's really easy to be pessimistic about something, but what's more challenging and to me far more rewarding is trying to figure out real solutions. So there is some good news that I see. Not even a decade ago, people said that paywall structures wouldn't work, that you would never be able to convince somebody to pay for something that had previously been free for as long as they could remember it. But we know now that that's not true. There are many publications that now have some form of a paywall, and they're making it work, and people are subscribing. Advertising is a totally different ballgame now, But publications are finding new ways and creative ways to diversify their revenue streams, whether that's by offering people the opportunity to pay for premium content or by providing some service to readers in addition to traditional journalism. And you guys are probably very familiar with this because you've seen a lot of websites that now have gift guides, or they review and they test consumer products. So basically what I think is, I work for NBC. And when the industry realized that people were finding new ways to get their news, we're now trying to meet them halfway there. At my company, we actually have an entire team devoted to producing a news show for Snapchat. And that's not something I ever expected to say a couple years ago. But the reality is that our stories are reaching many more people in so many different ways. And that to me is very exciting. To think that millions of eyeballs could be on a story across the world is empowering, and it also puts a lot of responsibility in your hands. So journalism, it's not dying. It's far from it, but it is changing. And what's great is that we can all be part of that change. When an industry is in flux, it can be incredibly disruptive. I know this. I've gone through cycles of layoffs. I've seen my friends get laid off from jobs. I've seen them get hired by other companies that then 6 months later they run out of money. I know it's disruptive, but it can also be a positive thing because it means that this industry is really wide open to innovation. Publications are looking for creative ways and to tell stories and to resonate with audiences, to reach readers and really be impactful. And we have many more questions and answers at this point, but it's an exciting time to be a journalist. So during my time here at UF, I had the opportunity to speak to a couple journalism undergraduate classes, and I know the idea was probably for me to teach them something, but I actually learned so much more from them. I loved hearing about their goals, and even this morning I was shadowing some PhD students who are looking at integrating technologies like VR and 360 videos with traditional storytelling, and I find that really inspiring. I know I'm going to go back to New York with a ton of ideas. I feel really galvanized. I have a hunger now, to tell these stories that I've learned about here, and I feel really inspired by this next generation of journalists, and it's been such an honor, really, to meet with these people and to talk about their hopes and dreams for their careers. I met Bob Woodward at a book event one time in Manhattan, and I told him that I was a journalist too. He shook my hand and he said, stick with it because it's the best job in the world. And I probably don't have to tell you that I'm incredibly biased in this regard, but boy, is he right. It is a great job, and thank you so much for coming. I hope that this has been at least helpful for some of the young people who are here in the audience, but I also hope that some of these lessons mean something to all of you because it's really changed the course of my career, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Get your question as well as Denise's answer. Don't be shy.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kathleen Frost. I actually just applied. You said space.com and livescience.com. I actually just applied to both of those internships, so I was wondering what you guys look for, or if you know what science-geared publications look for in a potential intern.
Sure. Well, first of all, I love your sweatshirt.
Oh, thank you. I'm a huge nerd. I'm sorry.
I'm a Gryffindor myself, but no. That's great. First of all, that's really, I'm really thrilled to hear that. I can definitely tell you a lot about the internship program because I was very heavily involved in shaping how the internship program is run. So what we look for is a basic interest in science. A lot of people think that they have to have a degree in it, or they have to have studied it, or even be in a journalism program that has a specific science journalism track, and that's not true because I'm definitely an example of how that wasn't true for any kind of hiring decision there. We look a lot for an enthusiasm and an interest in science, and then that's pretty much it. We know that interns come to us as students most of the time. Some of them are recent grads, but they're not meant to be fully formed, and so we use the internship program as really on-the-job training. I'm glad that you applied because I personally think it's a very good internship program, and I've gone through internships myself, so I know there's like a spectrum of how much work you actually get to do and how integrated you are in the newsroom. And at livescienceandspace.com, you basically are treated like a staff writer, so you have the same exposure to the editors, to other staff writers there, and you participate in all the same editorial meetings and story pitch meetings, and you basically have the same deadlines as staff writers. So you do get to write a lot, and you will come away with a lot of published clips. So that's the benefit that I always tell people, is that you really will write a lot, and that's the most important thing that I think for internships, because you really just want to get as much published work as you can. So I can talk offline with you if you want, and I'm happy to pass along information to the people who would be looking at the applications. But
Oh, that'd be great.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Hi.
Hi.
Well, I wanted to ask, I noticed that you talked about how you faced some kind of discrimination toward when you were working with a group that was with space. And I was wondering if you can expand on more like instances and obstacles that maybe Asian Americans face going to the journalism industry.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I think it's picking up so much of my breathing. I apologize for that. Yeah, I mean, so I thought maybe I would talk a little bit about this in the actual talk, because I felt remiss to not mention it with what's going on with the Me Too movement. Journalism, like any industry, is not immune to any of this stuff, and there is discrimination that goes on. Thankfully, it's gotten a lot better, and I think that the spotlight that's been shone on everything that's going on across many different industries is really forcing people to rethink newsroom practices and hiring practices. Specifically for Asian Americans, well, I think in general, I wish that there were more Asian American journalists. I think that we're catching up. You know, I have some colleagues and that are really focused on sort of looking at how to diversify newsrooms and how to actually make that a practice at the highest levels of hiring. In terms of my own experiences, so yeah, like I just had the fortune or misfortune, however you want to look at it, of being in an industry where it is very male dominated. And space reporting, you know, like I said, to be perfectly honest, still really is an old boys club. There are a lot of great female space journalists, but they're in the minority. I don't know that there's a solution. I think that the part of me that just tried to block it out was the part that just was naive about it, because I didn't really understand. I didn't know enough about the world at that point to know that it was discrimination that was going on. But it's a problem in most newsrooms, I would say, but it's not pervasive to the degree. Like, I don't think journalism is alone in this, is what I'm trying to say, is that I think this is true of many industries. What I did that I found very, very helpful, and they have chapters all over the country, so I'm pretty sure there's a chapter near here, if not in Gainesville itself, but the Asian American Journalists Association has been really instrumental in my career at this point in like either finding allies, meeting like-minded people, or even helping with things like job searches, internship searches, freelance work, or whatever. And I was very late to the game with professional organizations. I've spent so much of my early career just really head down, focused on just trying to be good at my job, that I didn't think about professional networking in a way that I probably should have. But I joined AAJA last year, and it's a very strong community of Asian journalists, and they are really great advocates for Asian journalists. So if that's if it's a concern for you, I would definitely join them, because they have a ton of resources behind them also to help with, if you're interested in certain topic of journalism, they have lots of connections and they can point you in the right direction, and there's a lot of great opportunities for mentorship. Part of how I got recruited to NBC was actually through AAJA, and so it's been a very valuable part of my career so far, even though I've only been a member for like a year and a half or so. But I hope that helps.
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Yeah.
My prerogative, even though I've had lots of time with Denise. So we were talking a little bit at lunch the other day about the war on science.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to get you to talk a little bit about whether or not you think journalism has contributed in any way, either to creating this problem, and in what ways journalism can help to solve the problem or end the war.
Yeah. Yes, I do think there is a war on science in some ways. It's unfortunate because I feel like as journalists now, we have to basically litigate every part of science that should not have to happen at this point. And I'm thinking in particular of climate change. When we write stories about climate change, we have to be so careful to cover all of our bases and couch a lot of things that science has shown us is actually really true. And so I do think, where I think that journalism has contributed to this is sometimes in the idea of false equivalency. It's something that it's so ingrained in our brains to find this balance, to find like you present one side and then you present another side. And that's one of the most basic tenets of journalism that you will ever hear. Everyone knows that. But in some cases, it creates a debate where perhaps there shouldn't be. And this is a problem in politics journalism as well. Sometimes it's not in the reader's service to do that. And I think it's very difficult to make that decision editorially because you're so used to presenting a balanced piece and to really just being like, we need both of these voices in there. I'm sure you probably saw some of the controversy that went on with some of the profiles that the New York Times did on neo-Nazis and everything. And it was the same idea that they had good intentions in presenting this piece, but because of the way that they did it and because of the value of it being a New York Times story, it sort of backfired a little bit. And I think in some ways that's what we face with climate change reporting as well, is that because we have to be so careful, because we are so trained to do this, false equivalency, that sometimes we're showing something as being up for debate that maybe isn't. And I don't know what the solution is really. It's very individual. So I've worked with editors who are, much more open to a little bit of voice in pieces, which I know is kind of counterintuitive for kind of basic journalism. And I've also worked with much more legacy media that is very stuck in a certain way. I think it's, in terms of a solution, I don't know really. It's really difficult. And I think that the climate that we're living in makes it even more difficult. It's, in some ways it's like we need science journalists now more than ever, and I'm glad to see that a lot of universities place such great emphasis on having programs that are specifically science journalism, and there are a couple in New York too, and I know that there's a lot that are kind of popping up and really strong programs around the country, and I'm glad for that because I feel like it's really important, and I don't have a solution unfortunately, but
All right, thank you very much.
yeah.
What advice do you have, like, for naives in this field to publish their content? Like, do you prefer we should start by digital media or print media, or let's say websites like social media websites like Facebook or Quora?
Yeah, well, I would say in terms of whether you should go sort of like print versus digital, well, the reality is that there are far more jobs in digital than there are in print right now. When I said that I wanted to go and work for a newspaper, the reality is that those jobs are shrinking, or the people that are in those jobs are sort of in those jobs and there aren't a lot of openings. But there's a lot of growth on the digital side, and there are a lot of new websites that are looking for tons of writers because they are new. And I would say if you're looking to get content published, and your best bet is probably in the digital world. And freelancing is probably, if you're I don't know if you're still in school or not, but
yeah, I'm still in school.
I'm
a
okay.
researcher in computer science.
Okay, yeah. I would say try freelancing, because especially if you come from as a subject matter expert, that's very valuable to a lot of publications. And I would say that I don't know, I'm not super familiar with Quora, but self-publishing is a luxury that we have now that, didn't exist 10 years ago. And sometimes that's the best way if you don't have, say, like a traditional journalism background, or you aren't able to sort of go through some of like the internship route or whatever. Self-publishing is enormously helpful because people do look at that, and it is a way to show. I mean, even if you're able to, like, if it's a blog or something like that, I've interviewed people based off of that, and it doesn't count you out of jobs at all. Any kind of writing that you do actually like is enormously helpful. So I would, if you can't do freelancing, I don't know, if you have publications in mind, but if that's not an option, I would definitely say to look at building up a portfolio just based off of what your interests are, and show that you as a computer scientist, you have already, a subject matter that you're very familiar with. And so, and use that as build a website. That's the biggest thing I could tell you, actually, because like that's an easy way for companies to go and see your work. But
One more quick question.
Yeah.
Do like scientific publications in like journals or conferences, do they count as publishing, or no?
not
Not really, right?
as journalism
Yeah,
clips,
okay.
but yeah, like unfortunately it's a little bit different because
Yeah.
they'll look at that and say it's for like a totally different audience, and
Yeah. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Hi, Denise. Again, I'm Cynthia Barnett. I teach environmental journalism here, and your talk was terrific. And I also loved your answer to Professor Walsh-Childers' question. And to follow up on that, well, one thing I would say is that one of the answers is something you do really beautifully at NBC site, and that is to instill wonder. You bring this beautiful wonder to science, and I think that's a big part of bridging this cultural gap that exists for how people feel about science. And one thing we really noticed, one time we really noticed that was the solar eclipse, right? Everyone around the country was looking in their special glasses, and they did that here on campus. And it was like this moment when everyone was looking at the sun at the same time. Mm-hmm. So this is a long-winded way to ask you a question about next year. I think will be the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, and I think we'll probably see a ton of journalism, and some of it will be kind of tropey 50th anniversary stories, but I think maybe there's a really cool opportunity to bring that wonder that we saw during the eclipse. So I was just wondering if you guys already have plans to do anything special about the moon next year, or if you have any ideas related to how we could think about that really important anniversary of this connection between Americans and the moon. Thanks.
I love that you talked about the eclipse, and because there have been a couple moments in my career where I've seen a very niche, or what seems like a very niche science topic, really spill over and inspire the public. The first one that I kind of point to in my memory is the Curiosity rover landing. I probably have told this story already this week, but I remember I was assigned to go and talk to people who had gathered in Times Square, and they had broadcast the launch and the landing live on the video screens that they use for like the New Year's ball dropping. And that to me was amazing. Like I was standing around looking at this giant crowd. Everyone was like jumping up and down and like crying. And it was like in the middle of Times Square. They were watching like a NASA launch and landing. And that was amazing to me. And the same thing happened with the eclipse. People drove hours and hours to go and watch this. And I actually spent the solar eclipse in Carbondale, Illinois. I went with a colleague. There was basically, Carbondale was called the crossroads of the solar eclipse because last year's eclipse, it was along the path of totality, and then the next one is also passing through Carbondale. So they basically took this opportunity to call themselves, the crossroads, and NASA had a big event that was there, and Southern Illinois University did a huge thing where they opened up the stadium and everyone was like watching it from the stands. So I love seeing that because that to me shows that, like, you know, science is super sexy and like, you know, like everyone's actually interested in it. It's not, everyone thinks it's a very niche topic, but it really isn't. And it has the ability to inspire tons of people. That's a non-answer though. For the Apollo, so yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this actually because we, especially at the site that I work for, we tend to put together these really big packages. And so I looked at next year and was like, oh, what a great opportunity to do something for the 50th anniversary. And I'll tell you what I have in mind if you guys promise not to steal my idea. So NBC is kind of flirting with the idea of maybe doing podcasts. It's something that a lot of publications are trying. It's very difficult though because it's one of those things that requires a ton of time and resources, and it's very difficult to kind of make money off of a podcast, and like everybody in their backyard is doing a podcast these days. But I become really obsessed with short form, or I don't really know what the right way to say it. It's like 8 to 10 episode podcast where it like has a hard stop and then that's the entire season, not ones that like kind of go on every week. I started listening to a lot of these ones. I find them really fascinating because it's like really deep dive into one topic. And the one that I listened to most recently was a Slate podcast that looked at Watergate, and it was kind of like little, not unknown, but like little known histories of Watergate, and they like each episode kind of followed one character or one event, and they really just kind of like dove really deep into it, and it's stuff that I hadn't even heard of, and I'm like obsessed with Watergate, so I thought I knew everything about it. But so my idea for the Apollo landing was I really wanted to do like an 8 to 10 episode podcast that basically was like the days leading up to the moon landing or planning this mission. And to do that, the reason I say don't steal the idea is because I literally have not pitched this to my bosses yet. But I really wanted to partner with NASA to do like a really inside look at all the amazing stuff that went into planning this and pulling it off, because they were using computers that are like, you know, my iPhone is more sophisticated than these computers that they were using. And that to me is amazing. They landed someone on the moon with that. And I looked at that, and I think that with MACH, our audience, or the audience that we're trying to inspire, is a younger readership compared to the NBCNews.com readership. And part of that, to me, I looked at, I was like, well, everyone knows about the moon landing, but so much of, you know, my generation, we didn't live through it. And so I wanted to recreate that wonder for people who didn't live through it, because I grew up with my dad, who would just constantly like regale me with stories about it. My grandpa would be like, oh my God, this, you know, we were sitting around the TV and it was so amazing, and I kind of feel jealous that I didn't get to experience that. So that's part of what I have planned for it. I'm sure that in the lead up to it, we will have more stuff. Actually, one of the big packages that we have planned for later this year on MACH is called Making of an Astronaut. And Making of an Astronaut Part 1 was really the big flagship package of stories that we used when MACH was first launched, and this was like back in January 2017. And it was so successful that they wanted to do a Part 2, and part of that, I'm assuming we'll have some moon stories in there. The main focus is kind of what we're doing to prepare people, like the first group of astronauts that may land on Mars one day. But I think rolled up in that will be 50th anniversary stories, I'm sure. Oh, so it's a new vertical that NBC News launched. It's called MACH. So even though it exists sort of on the NBC News homepage, it's sort of its own separate site. And that's where we focus a lot of our coverage on science, tech, and innovation. So it's MACH, like, you know, MACH, yeah. Yeah. I know, it's hard. Like, I say that word and I feel like most people don't know what I'm talking about, but yeah. But I was obsessed with fighter pilots growing up, so I get like giddy about it, but. Okay, well, I don't know if there are any other questions. Oh.
Just sort of a personal question. Do you think you'll have a chance to go into space? And would you want to?
Oh yeah, 100%. Yes, I would love to. I don't know. I'd like to think that with commercial I would like to think that there are some commercial spaceflight companies that might offer it to journalists. I mean, what an opportunity to like be on the International Space Station, like report for a week from there or something. Like that would be so cool. I don't know if it will ever happen. Like I don't even know how companies would ever ensure that. But I would go in a second. I would probably be violently ill on the way up there, but I would definitely go. Actually, when I was at space.com, George Whitesides, who works for Virgin Galactic, had mentioned that they ended up having a couple of accidents after we had this conversation, but he was saying that he really wanted, as a way to kind of spread the word and get people excited about commercial spaceflight, he wanted to bring journalists on some of these early flights. So I think there is a will to have, writers be there and to experience it so that we could tell other people about it and have people understand what it is that they're doing. I would love to do that, though. Yeah, like. Thank you. Yeah.
What did you conclude from those 14 interviews with the theoretical physicists?
What did I conclude? So, well, I joked about this because I said that I wanted to make the headline, "Can you time travel through a wormhole?" And then my entire article would be no. Because I was like, well, that would make my life a lot easier. And that's essentially what I heard, was that you can't, well, it gets really muddy. So essentially, a lot of people say no. But there are some theoretical physicists who say that, if our universe is one of many, then maybe other universes don't abide by the same laws of physics, because right now, physics as we know it, you can't travel faster than the speed of light. So the short answer is no, but then the hairier stuff is like the more mind-bending stuff about multiple universes, and I'm having a lot of fun with it, but it is, it's very intimidating. And I talked to Michio Kaku for this story, and he's a phenomenal science communicator, but he also just, like, I think probably 10 of those 14 pages are Michio Kaku, because he just tells story after story that's so amazing, and I'm just trying to catch up. And yeah, it's a fun story. I actually need to sit down and just do it. I feel like I've been ruminating on it for so long that I think I'm just like, okay, just do it. I'm like, actually, part of me like regretted pitching it, but yeah, it was like self-imposed. I find it, like, I always do this. I find really fascinating topics, and then I'm like, what did I do? But it's a fun topic to think about, at least. Yeah.
Are there other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.